Hello, hello. YouTube is over here. Facebook is over here. Assuming everything works well, it is 12:58 on Monday, January 11th. And again, if you're going to watch this later, I should probably say something of consequence here at the beginning. It is Good Monday. Snow is melting after the little mini blizzard we had, and it's a beautiful day. This is my third cup of coffee for the day, which it's a Monday. That's what happens. Here today to talk about yesterday's sermon on Vision 21, tied primarily to Ephesians chapter 4. Good afternoon, Jacob. Good to see you. Got some people logging in, checking in. I found out last week, somebody told me when we do these Monday breakdowns, they're watching on both Facebook and YouTube, which might skew our numbers a bit. And I think the point I'd like to make out of that is I think everybody should do that so that we can have more viewers and make us feel like it's really a runaway train of momentum, because I am an internet star. I'm totally not an internet star. Anyway, today I want to talk again about the stuff that's been going on, as well as the Sunday sermon. I had just had a quick conversation here in the office with Elisa, our office manager, director, the lady who really runs this place. I asked her if she wanted to be on camera. She said no. I said, what should I talk about? Should I talk about politics and President Trump and President-elect Biden and stir that pot and make everybody mad? And she said, no, there are enough worms that have been scared up. We need to try not to be controversial today. So for her sake, I'll try not to be controversial. Actually, for my sake too. It is great to have people. Thanks for checking in, you guys. Miriam, Lise, James, happy Monday to you. Now, yesterday's sermon was on our vision for 21, and it came out of Ephesians chapter 4. Now, Ephesians chapter 4 is one of the heartbeats of mine for ministry. It is such a great passage about how the church should be operating and how it should manage itself, and the breakdown between leadership and membership, the breakdown between the gifts God has given us that are different for all of us, and a variety of things, as well as the singleness of focus and the oneness of the church. And so to me, that whole section, I mean, that could be a 6-week series on that. Yesterday, what I tried to do is summarize it somewhat briefly so we get to the business side of the vision. But I really enjoyed kind of doing some of the Bible history, the church history stuff, the fact that Timothy was the pastor in Ephesus, the fact that Apollos, Aquila, and Priscilla were all in Ephesus, the fact that Jesus wrote a letter to the church at Ephesus. I thought, man, that's kind of fun stuff. And when I was on sabbatical back in 2019 is when Pastor Matt and Pastor Mike preached through Ephesians. So the church went through Ephesians in the last couple of years, but I didn't get to be a part of that. And that makes me sad, because I love Ephesians. It's such a great book about church. And as I mentioned in the sermon, the first 3 chapters are all about what God has done and our position in him. In fact, chapter 1, that's pretty much all it is. All the great things we have in Christ, all the great things that he has done for us, and our positional justification and the righteousness that we have from him, the adoption as children that we have from him. In fact, I remember doing a paper in seminary on Ephesians 1 and all the ways that the phrase "in Christ" show up in that chapter. And then in the end, it gets to how did you get to be in Christ? Paul asked the question, and the answer is when you heard the word of truth and believed. And so this idea that through faith we have access to all these, which then becomes kind of the theme of chapter 2, where you get the famous 2, 8, 9, and 10, that it's by faith. By grace we've been saved through faith, and it's not from ourselves. It's a gift from God, not by works of righteousness, so that no one can boast. But we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus to do the good works which he's prepared for beforehand that we would walk in them. That major theme of faith and what God has done and how the one triggers the other is just phenomenal. And last week we talked a little bit about the relationship between God's sovereignty and human faith. And I think Ephesians is another area where those two things are together a lot. And I love that idea. And then chapter 3 it goes on to talk about all that we have as a result of our faith, but ultimately then 4, 5, and 6, you get into the behavior and how should we then live, and that great passage at the beginning of chapter 4, which you talked about yesterday, that we need to be humble and gentle and bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace, and all those great things. I love just teaching on that. So that was the theme. Unity in 21. I think that's the idea. It would be great to model that to a world that has no concept of it anymore. Everybody wants it. Everybody longs for it, but nobody wants to do the hard work of maintaining that. So what are some of the things we can do to maintain the bond of unity in the spirit of peace, you might say? And I would say, if you say that, that's a really good question. You should ask that question, because I think I have a couple answers to that. One would be, we need to learn how to speak each other's language. When I see all the political stuff, that's the thing that really gets to my heart the fastest, is how little each side wants to speak the language of the other side. And what ends up happening is these arguments or debates, if it's about policy or if it's about a particular ethical issue in the country, or just political position, you have people arguing this on one side and arguing this on the other side, but because the words they're using don't mean the same thing to both sides, you end up having this. It's not even this, although that happens a lot. It's like they just like miss each other. And so there's just lack of understanding and lack of agreed upon terminology and lack of listening. And so one of the things that I think will chart the course of unity, and we do this when we do leadership training as well, is the best leaders are the ones that can speak the language of the people they're speaking to, not demand everybody speak their language. And I'm not calling anybody out in particular in saying this. It's just, I've seen it in my own life multiple times. I've worked for senior pastors when I was an associate pastor who either got this or didn't get this. And the people who demand everybody speak their language tend to come off as draconian, above the law, and there's not a humbleness to them. There's not a humility to them. There's not a gentleness to them. There's kind of this bull in the china shop every time they walk into a room. And a lot of times people say, well, they're just strong leaders. And I think, no, they're not strong leaders. They're very weak leaders. They're just loud leaders. They try to mask their insecurity through creating conflict or being bold. And I think the best leaders are the ones who embrace the conflict in a healthy way, not create it or avoid it, but just acknowledge it's going to happen. There's a great book out there on Abraham Lincoln, Team of Rivals. I think it won a Pulitzer, by Dorothy Goodwin, Kearns Goodwin, something like that. Anyway, but the idea was when he was managing during the Civil War, he worked with people on both sides of the aisle, and in fact even disagreed with people on his side of the aisle very openly, because that's what needed to happen to get from one point to the other. Now, again, I'm not trying to say anything about our current outgoing president or incoming president or either side of the party. I'm just saying within the church, what would it look like if we could listen well and we could speak each other's language and have a humility to our own positions and thoughts? And I'm seeing this in the bylaw process, and it's gone quite well, actually, in terms of the Q&A and the feedback. A lot of things that we've heard have been, hey, did you guys think about this? If you do this, if you move from this to this, have you thought about the implications of X, Y, and Z? It's like, that's the kind of help we want. And does it challenge maybe some of the big ideas we're trying to accomplish? Sure. But if the idea is true, it needs to stand on its own, not because of the weight of a personality or a position behind it. The idea itself has to be valid. And so, yeah, we carve it up and we look at it from a bunch of angles, and then we change it to what would be the smartest way to do it. And so that, I think, is what fosters unity. It's not just a mindless yes man and yes womanism. And as long as I'm in any sort of position of authority in any place, I don't want that. I don't want yes men or yes women. I want smarter people than me who have the courage to disagree with me in a way that speaks the truth in love, where there's still mutual encouragement. There's still the shaping of the idea that it's not a personal attack. I think that verse in Romans that I love is the idea of outdo one another in showing honor. To me, that's a huge core value. I want to show honor to people, even if I disagree with them, because they're made in the image of God. Even if they're mean to me, even if they're my enemies, I want to honor them as image bearers of God. And I respond really, really well to disagreement if there's honor happening in the room. I guess I'm as prideful and selfish as the next guy, but I try to be humble in the idea that, okay, I'll listen well, and this is a good idea because I want to learn your perspective, and I want to speak your language because that's the best way to influence anybody anyway. So I think those are some ideas to kind of work out that bearing with one another in love and shouldering that eagerness to preserve the unity and the bond of peace is the idea of let's learn to speak each other's language, let's listen well, let's honor each other. I think those are some of those kind of foundational things in order to accomplish that. Miriam writes, there's a good book out there by Sam Crabtree called Practicing Affirmation, affirming what we see as good and agreeable towards the other one who is in opposition. Yeah, disagreement is not hate. That's the other thing our culture is trying to kind of been feeding us for the last 10 years, that disagreement is somehow hate. And so we have to fight hard for our position if anyone ever disagrees with us. And I think we can show the world a better way that, no, disagreeing agreeably is totally a possible thing and is a healthy thing. But that doesn't mean we're dishonoring or hating the other person. We're just trying to listen and trying to learn and trying to grow. That doesn't mean that we're susceptible to every wind of false doctrine and human scheming. That's the other part of Ephesians 4, that's immaturity, to buy into every wind of thing that happens. One of the major things in the New Testament that, 27 books in the New Testament. I believe I did the count one time. I think it's 24 of the 27. It might low 20s, mid 20s have a statement and a warning against false teaching. It is a major theme in the New Testament because in the early church, this is what was happening because there wasn't set orthodoxy yet. This was a few guys coming out of Jerusalem, planting churches, trying to get them on the right path, discipling who they could to leave in charge, and then writing letters back. That's essentially how the church spread across the Roman Empire. And so it was very easy then when Paul left town for some other strong personality to come in and say, oh, you know what? Yeah, that gospel is okay, but there's also this and this and this. And then Paul would have to write a letter like he did to the Galatians saying like, no, those people are lying to you. Even if an angel tells you a different gospel than what I told you, he should be cursed because it's so easy to have those winds of change come through or to have a strong personality come through and then create a false doctrine as an add-on to sound doctrine. And in our day and age, that can come through a variety of means. It can come through the internet so fast. It can come through a dynamic personality who is a preacher on YouTube or on the radio or on TV. It can come through books that become popular. It can come through just so many ways we could be influenced. And I love that in Ephesians 4, it says maturity is the ability to see through false teaching. Maturity is the ability to stand firm against the winds and the waves of these influences that lead us away from the true knowledge of Jesus Christ, of growing into truly all the things that are his stature and his status. And so we have to be on our guard against those false teachings, even while we are honoring people, even while we are being teachable and humble in our hearts. We also have to hold in a closed fist the majors, the doctrinal things you don't bend on, while you hold in an open hand the secondary matters, the things that we all need to learn about. So yeah, it's a little bit of a tightrope, and I can appreciate that, and I know a lot of you can as well. But in the end, I think it is that combination that leads to a healthy church and a healthy Christian, is being teachable, but also standing firm on orthodoxy and knowing your doctrine. And so part of the plan that came out in the message yesterday about our procedures in 21 about disciple making is that educating on sound doctrine through the adult education stuff, as well as fostering the community in the small group model. We kicked around the idea, we being the staff and the elders, over the last couple of years. What does a disciple-making pathway look like? How do we get from here to there? And we kicked around the idea of, well, let's just do small groups, or let's just do classes. And even when we launched Sandstone, Sandstone was kind of a beta test in a lot of ways. We didn't think of it that way at the time, but in the end, it came out to be a beta test in a lot of ways of how to implement something from scratch, because at Sandstone, it was a lot more of a blank slate than what Lake Park was. And so we tried. We tried doing an intensive adult ed program. And it was successful in some ways and not so successful in other ways. With Lake Park, we thought, well, we'll never be able to like hit the stop button on the Sunday school machine because it's so robust and it's such a part of Grace culture here at Lake Park. So we'll have to tweak it as we go. Well, then COVID allowed us to actually stop it, and now we can relaunch it almost from square one. Similar to small groups, I don't know how many small groups have been meeting faithfully throughout 2020, and that's part of the problem, is we should have a better handle on what groups are in the church and who's in what groups, so that when it comes time to communicate, because we can't meet for 3 weeks or 6 months or whatever it is, we know how to check in with people. But because for so long at Grace, it was kind of do what you will, and we want to empower everybody to use their gifts just however they want, what happened is that everything was so decentralized. And in a lot of ways, it's good. You don't want to have to micromanage every little thing in the church. You want people to use their gifts well, and decentralization is a good way to do that. But if it's decentralized without a unifying strategy, then it's just like herding cats. And one of the things that we found as we tried to herd some of the cats is they said, well, you don't get to herd me. I get to do whatever I want. And it's like, well, no, we're not doing that. There's still to be a strategy behind it. Again, we're not trying to be draconian and micromanage. We just need to know what we know and what we can know. And so that's kind of the idea that we're heading towards on some of these things, trying to kind of shut it all down and then relaunch it as best we can. Yeah, there will be some things that are grandfathered in just because they are healthy. I have no interest in stopping what's good. Prayer groups, for example, that are meeting pretty regularly. We want more and more people praying. There's no reason to put that on any sort of leash. Let people pray however and whenever they want. And some small groups that are functioning just fine and don't need a corrective. We want those to continue on as they have. But some of those strategic nuts and bolts things are coming. The Vision Sunday isn't necessarily a time for nuts and bolts. And we have some great nuts and bolts people here, by the way. The joke for years has been, I'm terrible at it. And I talk the 10,000 foot view, but then the execution has to happen a different way. And a lot of times I don't go that extra step of communicating the execution. And I get that. And I have played into that joke quite a bit. But when Pastor Mike left this year and when Pastor Ben left this year, I went to the staff and I said, I am a professional. I have a postgraduate degree. I've been doing this for a long, long time. I really can do nuts and bolts. Punchlines notwithstanding, if you need me to roll up my sleeves and handle some of this, I totally can. And that's kind of what we've been doing with the bylaw rewrite and with some of the stuff going around here during the week. Obviously, Matt excels at it. James excels at it. Elisa excels at it. But we're all in on everything because there's so few of us right now. So yeah, some of that stuff will be coming, and it'll even be coming for me, if you can believe that. I know. Maybe we need to stop making that joke so people can believe that I can actually do those things. Yeah, other things about yesterday's service, we had a lot of new people, or at least people I hadn't met before at the 8:30 service. It was really fun. We had some folks who it was their first time setting foot in the building and needed help finding the sanctuary. That's always a good feeling. Like, thank you for joining us, especially on the day when we had 3 inches of snow and the roads are slippery. And so yeah, that was great. Had a couple of people come up to me afterwards and say, I want to be in a small group because of that sermon. Had a couple of people come up and say, I want to serve. Where can you plug me in? So it definitely seemed to speak to people. I've gotten good feedback. It's always weird when people are like, that was a great sermon. And I think, thank you. But the point is that God gets the glory and we all grow together. So I'm not saying don't encourage me. Believe it or not, most pastors don't have a big head. We are insecure beasts. And it's always that, 10 compliments to 1 criticism to balance out the emotional impact of them. So yeah, I appreciate that for sure. But at the same time, with a vision sermon like this, my hope isn't that you liked the sermon as much as my hope is that it accomplishes the goal, which is to get people excited about where the church is going and to get some participation going and fighting for unity and to feel a sense of momentum entering the new year after all that 2020 did for us and to us. So those are some of the thoughts that I had yesterday. Normally with these vision sermons, they're a little awkward for me, even though I typically use the same outline of, victories, values, vision. And usually the boats are always going to be a part of it. And sometimes I talk about other things like syncretism and separatism and where does the gospel fit and the 5 core values. That's pretty consistent. But I struggle because I'm not just in a text of scripture. for 35 minutes. That's my comfort zone. I want the scripture to be the sermon, not church business. But to do these every so often is important. And so I thought Ephesians 4, the business stuff of the church, was the interpretation of the text. So it married itself a little better yesterday than it has in previous vision sermons, which made me feel a little more comfortable up there doing that. And at the end, we did get to the gospel, because it's all about the gospel. And I get a chance to talk about the sacrifice of Jesus and the love he has for us, because that really is the key to everything we do, and never a bad idea to go back to that. One of the things that I mentioned in the sermon that we've been talking about, but I should probably pitch here on this video as well, if you are a Wednesday nighter coming to Romans class, or a small group that meets here, or your kids are part of the youth ministry, we start, kids ministry now is going to be available on Wednesdays as well. So as we offer more classes on Wednesdays and see more people coming, the first Wednesday of every month, starting in February, everyone in the building, other than the young kids, is going to all come together for a prayer time, music and prayer night that we'll be having in the sanctuary. Pastor Mike and I used to do these back before we launched Sandstone. We used to do them in what is now the chapel, and we'd get 30, 40 people coming to those, and they were awesome. But then when Sandstone happened and Mike and I were pulled in different directions, it just became harder and harder to do. So we would do them like on Maundy, Thursday, and Good Friday, and they were still awesome. And so now that we're back under one roof and we have a night that is kind of the standard night of being here, that's what we want to do, and really raise that prayer quotient and get us worshiping together. I think that's another huge thing to foster unity, is standing next to somebody, worshiping together with them. And we want to be able to, we probably won't be streaming those, because there's a lot of interplay between the people in the room and whoever is wearing the guitar, which is usually me. And so not all of that's going to make it onto a camera or onto a Zoom feed or anything like that. So those will most likely be in-person prayer times. And if it's 3 people, it's worth doing. If it's 30 people, it's worth doing. The more people that do it, the more prayers that happen. That to me is the lifeblood of the church. And really, not by might, not by power, but by my spirit, says the Lord. That's really how this has to go. Unless the Lord builds the house, those who build it labor in vain. Those are the kind of verses about pursuing any sort of vision that we have to keep in mind. And so heightening the prayer here in 21 is a key thing. All right, so I'm not seeing a whole lot of questions. I haven't really asked for a lot of questions. The other thing we've been doing lately is we use this time to also get into maybe some controversial theological questions, or just any theological questions where we can break down something extra. I don't have one planned for today, so I don't want to just pick one out of thin air, but if somebody has a question they want to throw in on YouTube or Facebook, I've got you both open, and I'm looking for it. Going once. Maybe you're typing. That's okay. I'm going to enjoy a little pick-me-up. Okay, one of the things I'm going to talk about then is what we've run into with the bylaws discussions. Last week, we went to all the board meetings, all 5 of our boards. There are 6 if you count the executive board. They meet this week. I got a good question from Tim as he was typing. I'll get to that in a second. But anyway, we visited all 5 of the board meetings, missions, trustees, hospitality, deacons, and elders, as a bylaw rewrite committee to kind of get their feedback and their questions. And the thing that I think we keep running into the most that we're going to really put into the second draft is the accountability of whoever is managing money in the church. Right now, the trustees manage the vast majority of the money, and they're accountable ultimately to themselves, but they've been doing a good job with it. The missions board oversees the mission spending, and they're accountable to themselves. And the Grace Care Fund is managed by the deacons, and they're accountable to themselves. And it's fine. Everybody has this kind of history, and they're working really well with that. What we want to put into the new bylaws, in order to streamline everything, we still want the financial trustees that are doing it to be a financial team, that they can be the clearinghouse and the communicating with the congregation of how we count the money and how we report the money and how the budget is presented and voted on by the congregation and all that. The elders do not want to get into that business. But the elders biblically do need to oversee that business. And so that's what we're trying to get to. But it leads to some feedback and pushback about, well, then who are the elders accountable to? And the answer would be to Jesus and to the congregation ultimately. But then there's also the idea of, if anybody handles money, should they be members? Who would they be accountable to if they have access to the financial records and the money? And those are things we're going to solve in the second draft, Lord willing. But that seems to be probably the number one issue we've run into. And I knew it would be. And it is a really important issue to make sure we're clear on and have solved well as a church. Tim's question: what do you think about discipleship right now, including helping people think through how to have healthy relationships with tech, since it's so heavily influencing people's thinking? That's from Catherine, not her husband, Tim. Thank you, Catherine. I'm assuming you mean relationships with tech, like watching YouTube or visiting websites or reading blogs or listening to podcasts, the kind of things that influence how we think. I was on a call with a bunch of National Free Church pastors last week as well, doing our monthly check-in with each other. And one of the pastors said, what we have in the United States is an epistemological crisis. Now, that's the kind of word pastors drop to each other, and we're like, yeah, we totally are, epistemological crisis. But most people might not have any idea what that means, and that's just because that's such a unique word to pastors. Epistemology is the science of how we think. Not what we think, not the specifics of I think this versus somebody else thinks this. It's the how we got there. That's what epistemology is. How did we develop our sense of ethics and right and wrong and what's true and what's not true? And honestly, if I ever went on to get a PhD, but if I were to, it would be on epistemology, because I'm convinced that throughout all of human history, nothing has shaped epistemology of the human race faster or more dangerously than the invention of the internet. The fact that certain ideas, for example, gay rights and the world's perspective on homosexuality, to go from being a shameful thing to talk about to a punchline on the playground to a disorder psychologically to everybody needs to be nicer to those people, to everybody needs to accept those people and give them equal rights, to if you disagree with what I say about this, you are Hitler and evil and you need to be eradicated from society, because it went, whatever your thoughts and feelings are, I have my very strong feelings about that biblically and socially and whatever they are. You can't argue that the global epistemological view on that topic shifted faster than any other topic in human history shifted. And so the idea that our epistemology, our brains are being rewired to interpret information, and our biases are being changed right and left super fast because of social media and the internet and facts not really being checked. And every side thinks the other side has fake news. And I agree with that pastor. It's an epistemological crisis. It's not just a disagreement, and it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. It's speaking the language of the people that have different opinions than you. Part of it is we need to train ourselves, and this goes to Catherine's question. I think a key part of disciple making now, I mean, it always has been, but especially now, is training people not what to think, but how to think. I think, in the fundamentalist 50s, 60s, and even growing up in the 80s, there was still quite a bit of that fundamentalism, and we were taught what to think. And even this kind of fear that to take back our country for the Christian worldview is essentially saying we don't like what they think. We need to weaponize what we think. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think it's much more about how we think. It's much more about how we're processing the information. And I think good discipleship is training people in a biblical epistemology. Think like Jesus taught us to think about kingdom things, about these values of peace and unity, and these things we've been talking about. It's not just think this about this particular fundamentalist behavioral issue. It's about, no, how did I get to that point? And how did my neighbor who thinks something completely different than I do get to that point? Because I bet there's something in there I can appreciate and understand. And then maybe I can speak their language. And I think that if we're going to be effective missionaries, in the next generation or 3 or 5, we have to solve internet epistemology, reaching people strategies. One of my best friends has a YouTube channel called the 10-Minute Bible Hour, and he and I together do a daily audio podcast through the book of Matthew called the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. And he felt so strongly about this. He left pastoral ministry at the church he was at in Wyoming to go full-time internet missionary because of how much was lacking from Christian content on good epistemology and how to think culturally and how to think biblically, that people didn't have a choice to pick good Christian worldview. They were just so inundated with all the rotten stuff. So I could talk about this for a long time, but I would just recommend, hey, while you're on YouTube, check out 10-Minute Bible Hour. It's really good. He and his son just did one last week on the doctrine of sin that is brilliant, and I think is far more effective at reaching the social media epistemology than what a lot of the rest of us pastors are doing on Sundays in our churches. But we're trying, and I'm trying, and we're expanding and trying to do that as best we can. But it means we have to stop fighting over stupid internal squabbles as a church and start understanding the war spiritually is a war of thinking. It's a war of epistemology right now, and we need to sharpen our tools for that. So thanks for that great question, Catherine, and for the feedback, those of you who have chimed in on that. That's my heart on that. Just kind of shooting from the hip. Someday maybe I will do some more study on that, or yeah, I don't know. I think I need more education in my life. One of the truisms of Christians is we're educated far beyond our level of effectiveness. But at the same time, I do like writing papers. I know I'm weird. So maybe I do go get that PhD in epistemology. But you never know. Anyway, thank you for checking in. It is 1:30, and this has been fun as always. I will be back on Thursday with another update about what's going on in the church. I will be back next Monday to recap that Sunday's sermon. Thank you guys for making this fun and for letting me do this. I will catch you next time.